Welcome to the Human Rights Institute 2019 Samuel Dash Conference on Human Rights. My name is Andy Schoenholtz. I'm the director of the Georgetown Law Human Rights Institute. I would also like to recognize members of the Human Rights Institute Fact-Finding Practicum who will present during the conference's third panel today. These students recently conducted a research trip to study the vulnerability of foreign fishermen to forced labor in Hawaii's longline fishing industry. They'll share their findings and recommendations with us later today.
Thank you again for joining us here today. Protection needs are at the heart of each of today's panel discussions, from asylum seekers facing populist nationalism to climate change migrants, to our fact-finding practicum discussing migrant fishermen vulnerable to labor exploitation in Hawaii. The legal community must continue to shed light and pioneer effective solutions. The Human Rights Institute Fact-Finding Practicum will launch its 2019 Human Rights Report, The Price of Paradise, Vulnerabilities to Forced Labor in the Hawaiian Longline Fishing Industry. Several HRI student researchers will share their findings on an oft-overlooked group of vulnerable migrants, the foreign fishermen that Hawaii's longline fishing industry depends on, who work without legal status and who are confined to their boats in the immediate pier. The panel will explain how these fishermen are vulnerable to forced labor, as well as their recommendations based on desk and field research throughout the 2018-2019 academic year.
Good afternoon. My name is Bethany Pereira, and I'm an International Legal Studies LLM here at Georgetown, as well as a student researcher with the Fact-Finding Practicum. So each year, the Fact-Finding Practicum allows a group of students to evaluate a relevant human rights issue and then to conduct a fact-finding investigation. The findings from this investigation are then incorporated into a report, which is published at the end of the year. And this year, our team decided to examine the extent to which migrant fishermen are made vulnerable to forced labor in Hawaii's longline fishing industry. And I'll just take a moment now to introduce our instructors and the team. So this year we were led by Melissa Sperber, who is the Director of Public Policy and Government Relations at Humanity United. And our team was also led by Ashley Benetti Armstrong, who is the Dash Muse Teaching Fellow here at Georgetown's Human Rights Institute. So our student research team was led by 10 law students. They include our 3 panelists today, Rachel Unger, Larson Binzer, and Madeline Carter, as well as Julie Valino, Charlotte Storch, Cara Palmer, Melody Vidmar, and Ingrid Schultz. And after a semester of extensive desk research and training, the team conducted a fact-finding investigation in winter of 2019. And so we interviewed a number of people, including U.S. and foreign government representatives, members of the community, and other individuals involved in the longline fishing industry. But most importantly, we were able to speak with non-U.S. citizen fishermen working on these longline boats. So our interviews consisted of group interviews with a number of fishermen or individual interviews with the assistance of a translator. And all of our interviews, we received verbal informed consent from every participant. We based our interview structure off of the International Labor Organization's Indicators of Forced Labor and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. So there are a number of indicators of forced labor that we looked for in our research. They included confinement, confiscation of documents, threats and intimidation, and restriction of movement. And by structuring our interviews in this way, it was easier to evaluate the experiences that fishermen relayed to us. So during our week-long visit, we conducted around 50 interviews. And today, my team will speak in terms of indicators of and vulnerabilities to forced labor. And this is largely because 1 week of brief interviews was unlikely to uncover concrete instances of forced labor. But the Hawaiian fishing industry is such an integral part of Hawaii's local economy and its culture. In 2017 alone, almost 34 million pounds of seafood landed in the port of Honolulu. The fishing industry fuels jobs in other industries as well, including ice houses, the boat yards, and fish auctions. And the demand for Pacific caught seafood has also grown exponentially in recent years. For example, in North America, poke, which is a traditional Hawaiian dish made out of raw tuna, is becoming increasingly popular. And many of these restaurant chains proudly advertise that their tuna is longline wild caught from the Pacific Ocean. But consumers often don't understand the labor practices being used to catch the seafood that they're eating. So while we have focused our research on Hawaii, a lot of what we found was problematic in a global sense, in that there is a widespread, larger problem in the global fishing industry. So there are an estimated 4.6 million fishing vessels operating in the world today, and between 260 and 800 million people depend on the global fishing industry for employment. So because the seafood industry is so globalized, there's an increased risk of human rights abuse, including in the form of forced labor. The Hawaiian fishing fleet is heavily dependent on foreign labor. A group of around 700 foreign fishermen bring in around $110 million worth of seafood each year in Hawaii. And these foreign fishermen come from Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Kiribati, and they come here to the U.S. in search of a better life. But they're often met with dangerous working and living conditions at a fraction of the salary that a U.S. fisherman would make. And on top of that, they don't have legal status in the U.S., so they're stuck on their boats or on the piers, unable to leave. And they're afraid or unable to speak to U.S. authorities because they fear being deported or being sent back home. And it's this lack of structure in terms of oversight of potential human rights abuses that was the focus of our research and inspired this report. And it's these findings and recommendations that will be the basis of our panel today. So thank you so much for coming to our launch and for your support. And now I'll turn things over to Rachel.
Thank you. So to begin, my name is Rachel. I'm a second-year student here at Georgetown and a student researcher in the fact-finding practicum. So when we first began researching the idea of conducting our study on allegations of forced labor in Hawaii's fishing industry, a series of reports published by the Associated Press immediately caught our attention. Those reports described a dire situation in which fishermen were confined for years on their vessels, completely at the mercy of their captains. One report in particular described the situation as a floating prison. After those reports came out, community members in Hawaii rallied to hold protests to demand accountability and oversight over this fishing industry. Those protests led to congressional hearings at both the state and federal level. Grocery stores stopped buying fish from the Hawaiian Longline fleet. Lawsuits challenging the state's process and lack of oversight over the fishing industry ensued, and a petition was even filed with the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. Tension spiked again in September 2016 when two foreign fishermen escaped the vessel on which they had come from Hawaii to San Francisco. They then brought a lawsuit against their former employer, alleging that he had subjected them to forced labor. Including the plaintiffs from that suit, 4 fishermen from the Hawaiian Longline fleet have been given T visas, meaning that immigration officials believe them to be victims of human trafficking or forced labor. So in response to, this series of events, industry actors banded together to develop policies and resources to demonstrate their commitment to decent working conditions. Legislation was also proposed to grant these foreign fishermen greater protections, but unfortunately it stalled in committee. Yeah. So here we are almost 3 years later, and in spite of the fervor raised by these series of events, we hadn't been able to see much evidence of how the foreign fishermen's day-to-day conditions or structural protections had actually improved. Like, the day-to-day lives of these fishermen didn't seem any different than before the reports when we first began. So, as Bethany mentioned, we traveled to Hawaii to see what the situation was actually like on the ground. So as a disclaimer, It's important to note that the scope of our investigation did not allow us to determine conclusively whether any individual fisherman is actually subjected to forced labor. Victims rarely self-identify for a number of reasons, and even if they did self-identify, we haven't really built up the trust. We were students coming in for 1 week. Who are we to earn their trust? So with those limitations in mind, we will begin our presentation by explaining some of the systemic vulnerabilities that are common to most, if not all, fishermen in the Hawaiian Longline fleet. And I will turn it over to Madeline.
Thank you. So before we start, I want to show you our agenda of where we're headed today. We're going to start with the vulnerabilities to forced labor in the Hawaii fishing industry, the impact of these vulnerabilities on the lives of fishermen, and then our recommendations to solve this legal thicket issue and this vulnerability to abuse that is rampant in the Hawaii fishing industry. And my name is Madeline Carter. I'm a second-year student at Georgetown. That was a big thing for me to remember to say. So we got to start with the recruitment and the travel to Hawaii. Why and how do foreign fishermen come to work in Honolulu? The captains and vessel owners recruit skilled fishermen from Southeast Asia, like Bethany mentioned, the Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the island of Kiribati. And when we spoke to these fishermen and asked them why they came to Hawaii, they cited a lack of job opportunities in their home countries and relatively lucrative wages being offered to them in Honolulu. Now, the base salary for most foreign fishermen in Hawaii is around $500 a month. And while that does not sound lucrative to us, we'll equate it to Filipino pesos. So $500 is about 25,000 Filipino pesos. And if we multiply that out to a yearly income, it's actually above the median income of an average Filipino family. So this is a big pull factor for them to come to Hawaii. Many of the fishermen we spoke to got jobs in Honolulu through brothers or friends or cousins who had worked in the fishing industry before and connected them to a captain. But others that we spoke to approached manning agencies or were approached by manning agents in their home countries who connected them to a vessel owner. And this is where the vulnerabilities to forced labor can really set in, because these manning agents are not regulated, so sometimes they charge excessive fees or hold debts over these fishermen to get them a job in Honolulu. Many fishermen we spoke to did not have to pay a fee, but others told us that they did. One fisherman, a recruiter took his motorcycle title in exchange for creating a contract. One had to pay $500 when he got back to get a security deposit back. So these vulnerabilities to forced labor, that's an indicator, an ILO indicator of forced labor is excessive recruiting fees. This can begin even in their home countries. So how do they get to Hawaii? This is a big question. Because they don't have legal status or work authorization, which Larson's going to dive more into in a second, they cannot fly into the Honolulu airport. So they fly from their home countries to American Samoa, where a longline vessel from Hawaii comes and picks them up and takes them back to Hawaii. And this journey from American Samoa to Honolulu can take weeks up to a month. And is very expensive in terms of fuel. So captains don't want to take this journey more than necessary. So they take out 1 to 2 year long contracts with the fishermen. And going home in between is nearly impossible because it's too expensive and the vessel owners can just replace them if they're gone for too long. So this kind of sets the stage for their vulnerabilities once they get to Honolulu. And that lack of legal status they have exacerbates those vulnerabilities.
All right. So the immigration system in my name is Larson Binzer. I'm a second-year student here at Georgetown, and I'm also a member of the fact-finding practicum. So this background of immigration law was a little bit confusing for us starting off as we were diving into this issue. So I just want to touch on our country's immigration system, how non-immigrant visas work, and how it applies to the foreign fishermen in this industry. So basically, everyone in the country, in the United States, who's not a U.S. citizen or a legal permanent resident, what we call a green card holder, need some kind of formal work authorization to be legally employed in the United States. So you're probably familiar with lots of these types of visas. There's H-1B visas for foreign workers in the tech industry. There's H-2 visas for foreign workers in the agricultural industry. Recently, they created a D visa for foreign workers who come to work on cruise ships that sail in U.S. waters. There's dozens of different types of non-immigrant work visas. And because they're non-immigrant, they don't confer any kind of legal status. All they do is they allow foreign workers to come here legally and remain here legally while they finish their employment before they either apply for a different kind of visa or return to their home countries. But these foreign fishermen aren't given any kind of work authorization or any kind of non-immigrant visa when they come to the United States to work in the Hawaii Longline fleet, which means they aren't technically allowed to be formally working in the United States. Yet somehow these fishermen were still procuring commercial fishing licenses, which allowed them to fish in U.S. waters, on U.S. boats, stay on the U.S. piers, and be steps away from U.S. soil. And moreover, to get the commercial fishing license in Hawaii, the Hawaii statute said that you had to be lawfully admitted. So you basically had to be able to lawfully work in the United States to be able to get that commercial fishing license. So we were very confused when we got all of this information and we're trying to put it together. So we reached out to the Hawaii Attorney General's office as well as some other local agencies. And the Hawaii Attorney General's office, unfortunately, wasn't able to speak to us directly, but in a letter addressing this issue had said, as long as these men stay on the piers, they're not technically on U.S. soil. So they're not technically unlawfully admitted, and they can technically be lawfully admitted enough to get these commercial fishing licenses. So that was a little bit confusing to us and put them in an immigration limbo where, again, they're on these U.S. boats in U.S. waters catching U.S. caught fish, but they can't step foot in the U.S. So we started talking to local agencies and the fishermen themselves about how this process works. How can they even get to the point of getting these commercial fishing licenses and working here without any kind of visa? So they explained to us that when they arrive to Honolulu, they have what's called a crewman's landing permit. And this permit, if approved, would allow them to enter U.S. soil to take care of their basic human needs while the boat is docked and the fish are being unloaded before they go back out on another voyage. So going to the grocery store, seeing a doctor, buying, clothes or medical supplies, or getting postcards to send to their kids, whatever it is, this crewman's landing permit would allow them to do that. However, because they don't have any kind of work authorization, any kind of non-immigrant visa, like I was explaining, these are systematically denied by Customs and Border Patrol, these crewman's landing permits. And that means that these men cannot set foot on U.S. soil, and they are confined to the piers and the vessels that are docked in the piers that they've been working on. So we were very confused, again, by these fishermen being confined to the boats with no visa, no work authorization, yet still able to get these commercial fishing licenses. How does that happen? So the captains of the boats take the men's passports, and they take these denied forms, these crewman's landing permits that are stamped as rejected by CBP, Customs and Border Patrol, and they go down to the Department of Land and Natural Resources, which is the Hawaii agency that issues these commercial fishing licenses. And this denied form and this passport, or the copy of the passport, is enough to get the license. And I was actually at the Department of Land and Natural Resources and was interviewing some of the representatives there. And one employee came in and showed me a fisherman's file. And it was just the denied form and a copy of his passport. And she said, oh, that's enough to get the license, even though that doesn't mean that they're lawfully admitted. So I questioned them on this and how this scheme came to be, and they didn't really have the answers. And the agency highlighted to me that their focus is not human rights. They're not a human rights agency. They don't have a specialization in immigration law. They don't really know the details of what lawfully admitted means. And that's somewhat fair. We can't expect every single government agency to be a human rights watchdog and be policing these things. But when I asked them when they started accepting these denied forms as proof of lawfully admitted status, they had no idea. And to make matters more complicated, when going back a couple of steps, when CBP does initially stamp these forms denied, these crewman's landing permits, they also put every fisherman on a list for deportation. So these men, while they're confined to the boats, again, U.S. boats, U.S. waters, are technically in deportation proceedings. And most of the time, these deportation proceedings, these removal proceedings, don't go into effect. As long as these men are staying on the boats and doing everything they're supposed to do, not causing any problems, CBP doesn't usually deport them. However, they can be deported at any time. They make a captain mad, they want to file a complaint, they're late one day, they have a problem, they have an emergency. There's a system in place for them to be deported immediately. No recourse, no remedy, they're sent home. So that lack of status, that lack of ability to find those recourses is very troubling to us as human rights researchers and to the fishermen themselves. They explained it several times. But it also makes us wonder, back to what Bethany was saying about how we're labeling this as U.S. caught fish. So we are marketing this as locally caught, as caught in U.S. waters. And as one advocate put it, we're trying to create this idea by marketing it that way, that our Hawaiian uncle was out fishing over the weekend, and now it's being sold in Fairway. But that's very much not the case. It's foreign fishermen who are coming here with no legal status, confined to the boats that are catching this U.S. caught fish. So another issue that stems from this lack of legal status is that these men are very isolated from resources to try to fix some of the problems that we've been discussing. So Rachel's going to dive into that now.
Thank you, Larson. So the fishermen's lack of legal status leaves them in a precarious and isolating situation. This makes accessing any sort of remedy extremely difficult. For example, foreign fishermen can't bring claims under all the same U.S. laws that are designed to protect other workers in the United States, regardless of, what type of visa that they're on or whether they are citizens. However, even if those laws applied, the fishermen can't leave the piers on which their boats are docked to meet with an attorney. This was actually something that I experienced personally when I was working in Honolulu this past summer. While there, I was interning for a nonprofit that wanted to look into potential cases of labor abuses in the fishing fleet. However, when I was trying to get a sense of what was actually going on the ground, I barely could get access to the docks where the fishermen were living. There, are gates guarding some of those piers. There are security cameras installed on many of these boats. There are guard dogs. And even if I could get past, some of these devices, there's no way that I could get a moment actually alone with a fisherman, protect his confidentiality adequately, to get a sense of, what his case was about. Practically speaking, it is also extremely difficult to represent a client when you don't speak the same language as them. And on an island like Hawaii, there are very limited resources in terms of translators. So unfortunately, those challenges were not unique to me. Almost all of the advocates that we spoke with while we were in Hawaii faced the same sorts of frustrations. However, this is not to say that the fishermen have no form of recourse whatsoever. As I mentioned earlier, industry actors kind of banded together to develop some key resources after the AP reports came out. Those resources included an employee handbook and a code of conduct, which both provide some information about how fishermen can bring complaints if they're experiencing any sort of abuse or substandard conditions. So there are two potential options for fishermen per the handbook and code of conduct. The first is to go to CBP, the agency that can subject them to deportation at any minute. The second is to go to what's called the Seafarers Ministry, which is a local community organization based out of a church that comes to visit the fishermen twice a week and provides them with medical services, food, and spiritual guidance. Madeline will get a little bit more into the details of how this ministry works with the fishermen in a minute. So unfortunately, though, while some of these volunteers from the Seafarers Ministry speak the same languages as the fishermen, they're expected to be on call 24/7 without any compensation or real leverage to exercise. So what ends up happening is a fisherman will call a volunteer with a grievance complaint, and the volunteer will then call the complaining fisherman's captain, which already destroys any confidentiality that he might have had. However, at that point, the captain essentially has a choice whether or not to listen to the volunteer. And in some cases, the captain simply ignore them. Ideally, next, what would happen is the volunteer could then call the leaders of what's called the Hawaiian Longline Association, or a trade association comprised of all the boat owners and captains within the Hawaiian Longline fleet. Because of their position, they can exercise leverage over the ship captains to ensure that they fix whatever the complaint concerns. Again, this is what would happen in an ideal world. But as we learned from the doctor who fields some of these calls, very serious complaints have been brought by the volunteers who operate this grievance process and have been met with absolute silence from the industry. For example, one of the doctors came across a live case of tuberculosis, which is highly contagious and can be fatal if not treated immediately. When he brought this to the captain of the Fisherman who presented symptoms, he was completely stonewalled. It wasn't until he called the CDC and had the federal government get involved that the industry actually stepped in to help find this patient zero and quarantine those who had potentially been exposed. So the point of this example is, if it was this difficult for volunteers to bring a complaint about something that industry, government, and civil society stakeholders all have an equal stake in, imagine how difficult it must be to bring complaints that implicate the existence of forced labor. So next, I will turn it over to Madeline, or to Larson, to explain how some of these systemic vulnerabilities impact the day-to-day lives of these fishermen.
Thanks, Rachel. So we've talked about a lot so far. A lot of things going on in this fishing fleet and things that these fishermen are facing every day that can make them very vulnerable to exploitative situations. They don't have legal status to be able to walk onto shore and find an attorney if they have a problem. They're in constant fear of deportation, and that, creates a chilling effect with how much they're going to report about their circumstances. These conditions are very rough, which is true across the industry, but much harder when you can't complain about potentially abusive conditions. And they can't go into town for basic needs, and they're relying on people, out of the goodness of their hearts who are coming to the docks to help these men. So we were investigating some of these issues and kind of narrowing down from the greater issue of them not having legal status. We found was that these captains have all the discretion in the world in how they treat these men and how much control they have over their working conditions. They can basically affect their working conditions in any way, and there's no oversight. There's no one coming and making sure that these captains are treating their workers fairly and that the working conditions are okay for human beings to be undertaking on a daily basis. So when we spoke to some of the fishermen and we asked them, what is your life like here in Hawaii? How are you, handling all this going on? Almost all of them replied, it depends on the captain. And some of them went so far as to say, if you're here and you have a great captain, life is great. But if you're here and you don't have a great captain, life can be terrible. And some captains treat them well. I don't mean to say that every captain is out to exploit their workers. They, give them fair wages and, opportunities to get pay raises or bonuses. They make sure that they have adequate medical care. They make sure that they have safe working conditions. But if the captains don't treat them well and they don't, out of the goodness of their hearts, make sure that these men are cared for, nothing happens. So as a result of this, some of these fishermen under captains who aren't necessarily as generous are making $350 a month, even though the average foreign fisherman makes $500 a month and has the opportunity for bonuses and pay raises and to build up seniority. And some of these fishermen are working 20 to 22 hours a day while they're out at sea. And this makes them exhausted, and they're working with incredibly dangerous equipment, and they kind of get into what people refer to as a zombie mode when they're out there for weeks at a time, sleeping 3, 4, 5 hours a night, doing this heavy lifting every day with this dangerous machinery, and it leads to a lot of injuries. We've heard stories of people getting terrible cuts that got infected, having fingers and hands ripped off because they're working with these dangerous things on these ships with essentially no sleep. And again, I want to say not all captains are like this. Some captains treat their fishermen just like any of us in this audience would if we were running a vessel. But if they don't, if they do perpetuate some of these difficult circumstances that I've been addressing, nothing happens. Nothing happens to these captains if they abuse their men. And like we keep saying, what can these men do? A lot of them don't speak English. They're isolated. They're dependent on others. They have no status to be able to go and reach out to people for help when they need it. And that just makes them ripe for exploitation. And some of those things are expected when you work in a foreign country, to be isolated, to feel like you aren't around people who share a similar cultural background or religious background, to maybe feel lonely or depressed. That's normal. But to be a potential abuse victim with zero ability to access any kind of resources or remedies, even though they're all available to you a mile away, if you could just step foot on U.S. soil and seek an attorney, that makes the situation absolutely right for human rights abuses to take place. So a major issue in this whole scheme of them not being able to seek any help or any remedies is that they don't have the ability to access medical care regularly. So Madeline's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Larson. So the vessel owners are obligated to provide for the fishermen's medical needs, but in reality, all of their medical assistance is given to them by 2 volunteer doctors and a group of medical students from the Seafarers Ministry. They come at night, once a week, to 2 of the major piers. They roll out a bin of pills and first aid. They have card tables, or they sit on public benches, and the fishermen who choose to partake in these services come off their boats and meet them. The doctor told us that many suffer from high blood pressure issues, diabetes, there's some mental health issues, depression from the difficult work and being far away from home. In addition to the work injuries, they're working with giant hooks that they throw out into the ocean so they can get cuts in their arms. One fisherman told us that a shark got caught on one of the lines, which cut into his skin. So the doctors and the medical students are dealing with a lot of different things every single week. What happens if there's an emergency? If a fisherman really needs to go to the hospital? And unless it's a life-threatening emergency, the fishermen have to get permission from Customs and Border Patrol to get parole to leave the piers, which costs $65, which the vessel owners are supposed to cover. But as is the theme of what we were saying, if they cover it, that depends on what they deem to be an emergency. Many fishermen said that their captains do allow them to leave, but others gave us examples of some times when fishermen were not allowed to leave, and more serious conditions arose. For example, an advocate told us that there had been several amputations, and the captains did not deem those follow-up appointments on those amputations to be valid to leave the piers, and did not take them to those appointments. One fisherman suffered from headaches, and the captain didn't think it was very serious. They kept having headaches for months until he went to the hospital, and because he couldn't go to the hospital sooner, he slipped into a much more serious condition and had to stay in the hospital for a year. But a person with status could have known their own body and taken themselves to the hospital. But because they have to get permission from Customs and Border Patrol and their captain to believe them that they are seriously ill, much more serious conditions can ensue. So in addition to filling this gap of medical assistance, the Seafarers Ministry also steps in to fill in the gaps when their basic needs are not met, or food accommodations are not met. So in addition to bringing a doctor to the piers twice a week, the ministry also brings hot food and supplies to these fishermen. They've been working with them for years, and they have seen consistent needs that new fishermen need when they come to Honolulu. So they have welcome bags prepared for every new fisherman, which include donated pillows, pillowcases, long sleeve t-shirts, and toiletries. And one of these days on the piers, I was standing next to the head pastor of this ministry, and he got a phone call from a Filipino fisherman asking if he could go pick up some pancake mix for him. And I said, "How often do these fishermen call you?" And he said, 24/7. I am ready to answer them and get them what they need. And this generosity is incredible. And these fishermen really enjoy getting medical services and to eat food with the volunteers. However, the ministry is shouldering this burden of keeping the seafarers healthy and as content as they can be, just because they can't walk across the street to buy themselves pancake mix or because their employers choose not to provide for them like they're supposed to. And so a theme that we've talked about is how fishermen can have different experiences in Honolulu based on their captains. And so Rachel is going to dive a little deeper into that.
Thank you. So as we've been discussing, the fishermen essentially live with a sort of Damocles hanging over their heads. They can be sent home at any point from the minute that they step onto shore or arrive at the port. So when captains threaten to deport them if they don't follow orders, this leaves the fishermen without much of a choice. For example, some captains will threaten or use these threats of deportation and intimidation to compel the fishermen to perform additional jobs that are outside the scope of their contract and without compensation. For example, one fisherman said that every time his boat goes out onto open ocean, his captain forces him to do something like untangling the fishing nets from, the motors of the boat, or something highly dangerous and which requires skills and training that the fishermen may not have. He also explained that they are forced to do these kinds of jobs out on the open water because it increases the chances that they'll evade detection by the Coast Guard. The shame is, even if they are caught by the Coast Guard, the fishermen are the ones who are sent home. The captains may get a fine, but that would be the extent of the consequence. We also heard from many fishermen that their captains may threaten to deport them if they try to speak out about substandard living conditions, safety equipment, or just the fact that they have to perform these additional jobs. Some captains will go even further and threaten to not only have the fishermen deported, but to blacklist them so that they can never return to Hawaii. This, in particular, bears a lot of weight on fishermen who have come all this way to obtain an economic opportunity that they may not be able to enjoy otherwise. So, in addition to the use of threats and intimidation, we also found that some captains will treat foreign fishermen better depending on their national origin. For example, if a fisherman shares the same nationality as his captain, he may enjoy benefits such as, better food or more rest time, or just not having to bear the brunt of the verbal abuse that the captain may subject other fishermen to. As a result of this type of treatment, many of the fishermen suffer from psychological harms, which again, they have no access to receiving treatment for because they can't leave the piers or their boats. And as wonderful as the Seafarers Ministry is, there are no psychiatrists or therapists that go with them. So finally, as we've discussed, the fishermen's captains are required by law to confiscate their passports and to keep them confined on their fishing vessels from the minute they arrive in Honolulu. Holding this much power over any worker is already highly problematic. However, when combined with this type of coercive conduct on the part of the captains, it would make any fisherman feel he has no other choice but to remain in an employment situation, abusive or not. So to conclude, we've discussed how fishermen's lack of legal status, isolation and confinement to the fishing vessels and piers on which they're docked, and the disparity of treatment that they face from their captains creates conditions that are ripe for abuse. Now, I will turn it over to Larson to begin discussing how we may begin to address some of these issues and support the fishermen that we interacted with.
Thank you. So I think it will come as no surprise that our first recommendation focuses on resolving the foreign fishermen's lack of legal status. In 2017, U.S. Senator from Hawaii, Mazie Hirono, introduced the Sustainable Workforce Protection Act. And that legislation did two major things. First, it granted a D3 visa, created the visa for these foreign fishermen coming to work in the longline fleets in the United States, which would allow them to temporarily enter the United States while their vessels are docked here. So they can come in and take care of all of their basic necessities without fearing deportation. And second, it clarified some of the jurisdictional confusion about who has oversight over these different situations that are going on in the fleet. So who has oversight over the captains, who has oversight over the vessels, who has oversight over these men's working conditions. So we suggest reintroducing the Sustainable Workforce Protection Act, which unfortunately died in committee in the last Congress, or some kind of similar legislation that would confer this legal status and clarify some of these jurisdictional issues. So on the first point of legal status, we think that legal status would absolutely transform the lives of foreign fishermen in the United States without question. And when we spoke to people on the ground in Hawaii about this, there was great support for these men having legal status, and not just from the fishermen and not just from human rights advocates, but from captains and from the Hawaii Longline Association leadership and from local attorneys, local agencies. I think everyone sees that this would be a mutually beneficial scheme that would reduce a lot of these vulnerabilities and would be economically beneficial for these captains. If these foreign fishermen got legal status, it would allow captains to fly these men in and out of the Honolulu airport, which would be a lot cheaper and a lot faster and a lot more reliable, frankly, than them having to come all the way to American Samoa and be picked up by boat. It would allow the men to visit their families more often, which would stave off some of the depression and isolation issues that we've discussed, and they would be able to go for a couple of weeks and come back without that problem. And it would allow men to finally be reliant upon themselves and stop having to rely on the generosity of people who happen to come to the Piers, the Seafarers Ministry, other volunteers, for everyday necessities like pancake mix. So this would be a really good thing for everyone in the industry. And then secondly, like Madeline said at the beginning, this has been a legal thicket. Every agency that we've talked to about the jurisdictional scheme surrounding this issue has been confused. Nobody's been actually able to say who has oversight capabilities over these vessels and these captains. So it's been a lot of finger pointing and just a lot of confusion. And a DOJ task force was created last year to kind of address some of these jurisdictional issues and provide some clarity. And the results of that task force study or that observation will be coming out soon. We're really looking forward to seeing them, but before they come out, Madeline is going to discuss some of our ideas for how agencies can take control of this situation.
Thank you. So we've identified three agencies that we think could step up in this arena. And the first one is the Department of Commerce's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association, NOAA, which is much easier to say. Their boat observers board fishing vessels, but they're really looking out for illegal, unreported and unregulated fishing. But we think they're in a prime position to also be looking for indicators of forced labor. So our recommendation is that these boat observers be trained in what forced labor looks like, have a place to report it to, and that the observers are protected from retaliation against boat owners and from the fishing industry if they do make these reports. The second agency we've identified is the Coast Guard. So the Coast Guard conducts health and safety inspections on these vessels, and again, they're in a prime position to also be looking for indicators of forced labor. So we recommend that they be trained in that and have a place to report it to. And then lastly, Customs and Border Patrol. We've mentioned them multiple times, and they are vital to step up in this area. One, because they interact with fishermen on multiple occasions when they come into Honolulu, when they need to be granted parole. And because we know they have a forced labor division at Maine DHS, and we know that they care about this issue. And they may have systems ready in place, but it was very difficult for us to get in contact with Honolulu CBP officials. So we just recommend that they implement the systems that they have, that they take this issue seriously. Because every year the United States authors a trafficking in persons report on every single country, where we point out the flaws in other countries' fishing supply chains. But if we forget our own, then what does that show? So by our government taking responsibility in this and stepping up, we show that we really care about combating forced labor. So in addition to the government stepping up in this arena, private actors and businesses need to step up as well. And Rachel's going to talk about that aspect of our recommendations.
Thank you. So our report makes two recommendations for private actors working within the Hawaiian Longline industry. First, the grievance processes that I described earlier need to be revised to ensure that it protects fishermen's confidentiality and results in successful outcomes that actually benefit the fishermen. Second, industry leaders should exercise their leverage to design effective oversight and monitoring systems to ensure that actors who are not complying with the terms of the code of conduct that they sign and ascribe to are actually implementing its terms and abiding by them. So while the Hawaii Longline Association does exclude captains from selling fish at the Honolulu Fish Auction, which is perhaps the most lucrative fish market in Hawaii, they're without any way of identifying or having some sort of oversight mechanism to ensure that those that captains are actually complying with the code. This guarantee or this form of leverage does little to actually influence employers' conduct. So in designing and thinking about how to make these systems more effective, we recommend that fishermen's input is sought and actually incorporated at all stages of the process. Engaging foreign fishermen's own thoughts and experiences is critical to ensuring efficacy. Second, engaging civil society actors and legal advocates in these processes may also help to ensure that fishermen who would like to participate feel comfortable speaking out, or at least that they have an advocate to speak on their behalf if they don't. In sum, though, we don't assume or intend to suggest that our research provides a comprehensive overview of all these fishermen's needs or insights or what they want. Therefore, in addressing existing vulnerabilities to forced labor, actors from the government, civil society, and the industry should continue to consult and incorporate the feedback of fishermen. They must step into their shoes, listen to every stakeholder, and advocate for solutions that keep the fishermen themselves at the center of the issue. Thank you so much for coming today. Before we conclude, I just want to say, please keep an eye out for our report, which will be coming out at the end of April. If you are interested in receiving a digital version of the report, please sign up with one of the ladies at this table over here. Someone could raise their hand. Okay, thank you. Right now, I will shift to Madeline to field questions.
Yeah, if anyone has questions. Yeah, if you could just introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Carl. Again, I'm retired.
One moment, Carl.
Tell me about your interaction with the Coast Guard, both the commanders and the individual staff. Could you talk with them off the record and get the feel of the men who manned the Coast Guard boats and what they thought, or did you even try?
You want to take that?
We did try. We did get some communication off the record, which is what kind of happened with a lot of the government agencies, that you have to be off the record, or even if, like, other departments, they had to get weeks of approval to be able to speak with us. But we did speak to some people at the Coast Guard. And it influenced our recommendation that they be trained, because it's not happening currently. Yeah.
And if I can make a gentle reminder, please line up at the microphones, introduce yourself, and give your affiliation. Thanks so much.
Oh.
Hello, my name is Shane Armstrong. I have a question. Are there any other analogous situations in the United States where this may be happening other than Hawaii? Is it more of a Hawaii state law phenomenon, or is it more indicative of U.S. laws in general?
Take that. Yeah. So while we weren't looking specifically into any other situations within the U.S., it is federal law that captains must confiscate and confiscate the passports and keep fishermen confined to their vessels if they are not documented. Similarly, the immigration scheme that we've discussed is also experienced by foreign fishermen nationwide. And unfortunately, some of the reasons why individuals may not self-identify or feel like they even deserve to come forward with complaints is not particular to this group of individuals necessarily. But in terms of actual information on other situations of potential forced labor, I'm sorry.
That wasn't the focus of.
Yeah.
Good question, though.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Hey, Brian Johnson. Certainly the level to which they're being treated is unacceptable. To what extent are harsh conditions inherent in the fishing industry? Like, I assume being out on the ocean for weeks at a time just kind of comes with the territory. And also, it was mentioned that often the captains and the fishermen share a nationality. What is the legal status of the captains? Are they U.S. citizens? Are they also foreigners that are working here? Just what's going on there?
For the second question, all of the captains are U.S. citizens. However, there are many Vietnamese Americans on one of the piers, Pier 17, who are the captains. So,
Yeah.
We also found what's really interesting. There's a scheme of individuals who are, what's called paper captains. So essentially, a U.S. citizen in name is the captain, but that's the extent of it. He may be the one who actually brings the fisherman's documents to get licenses at the DLNR. But he doesn't actually know how to drive the boat or go out on the water with the fishermen. Like, those are the actual captain by actions is someone who may also be foreign or who has been working with the owner of the vessel for a number of years. So.
Yeah. And to your first question about the conditions of the fishing industry as a whole, so these conditions are rough, whether you're American or you're foreign. This is a very difficult industry, and that's kind of what's driving these captains having to go overseas to find people who will do the work, because it is so grueling and the pay is so low given the type of work that it is. And there's a lot of skilled fishermen in the countries that we mentioned, these fishermen coming from. The difference is there's oversight over U.S. citizens working in the fishing industry. So if there's an abusive situation, if they have a captain who won't pay them or who's paying them unfairly or something's going on or they're working 22 hours a day, there's a reporting mechanism. They can come off the boat and go into Honolulu and report it and find an attorney. These men can't. Also, there's a discrepancy in how they're paid. We're not advocating necessarily that foreign fishermen be paid the same as U.S. fishermen, but U.S. fishermen make on average $8,000 to $12,000 a month. Is that correct? And these fishermen are making on average $500. So there is kind of a discrepancy there as well in what the compensation is looking like for the same type of work.
Hi, I'm Camilla. I'm affiliated with the Institute through the 1L Human Rights Associates program, which Ashley leads. I know you mentioned poke as well as like the fairway market. So I'm curious how you tracked sort of the supply chain and where the fish is sold and what kind of buyers are buying the fish, whether it's industry, restaurant industry, retailer, someone like me going to fairway. Where is that coming from?
Yeah. Okay.
So actually, one of the potential advocacy projects we'd like to engage in is seeing how the supply chain interacts with like DC restaurants or supply chains in general. In terms of kind of the larger supply chain, so as I mentioned, grocery stores stopped buying the fish after the AP allegations came out for a little while. Those grocery stores included, Whole Foods, Costco, Sam's Club, like all these major outlets that we all, shop at. And I'm not sure we didn't study in depth like the exact, every single chain or pathway that the fish take, but there was an example that we heard of fish that had been infected in Hawaii, making its way to California, and that led to a hepatitis outbreak. So, the fish is definitely not being sold only within Hawaii. We've also heard that, very expensive and like trendy sushi restaurant owners will have the fish flown out directly from the fish auction that I mentioned earlier. So it's going all the way across the country. But as for whether our local grocery stores are buying from the fish auction, that is something for us to figure out in the next month.
Hi, my name is Mark, and I'm a 2L here at Georgetown. I'm wondering if you guys have determined exactly why the Sustainable Workforce Protection Act, precisely why that was never passed and died in committee.
So, yeah, there weren't really heavy reasons for why it died in committee. I think there was a lot of uproar and outrage when those AP reports first came out, and that's what led to the introduction of the act itself. And then just going through the different committees with the Senate bill and then the sister bill in the House, it just kind of died with other bills taking import and like Rachel had talked about, the issue kind of dying out and like the retailers starting to buy these fish again and everything happening. So we're really hoping that with this report and the DOJ task force, we can kind of reinvigorate that fire that was initially there, trying to get these men some kind of legal status and address the issue. But as far as we were able to tell, it wasn't necessarily like a partisan issue or any like one factor that killed the bill.
Hi, I'm Beth Ann Vidmar, Melody's
Oh
mom.
my gosh.
Hello.
daughter's
That's my only affiliation. I don't. I'm wondering, in your hope about the fishermen getting legal status, do you have any concerns in the current administration on what those prospects are?
So that's a great question.
Yeah.
A great question. So we don't necessarily have any concerns about this becoming a partisan bill. We actually think that it has a really strong foundation to be a bipartisan bill. One, because trafficking in general is a bipartisan issue. If you look at any trafficking bill, it's definitely bipartisan with support on both sides. And two, this is about formalizing our immigration system. So as these men are coming in and they don't necessarily have this formal legal status, but they're just steps away from U.S. soil, it's not as formalized as many other types of non-immigrant visa processes are as people are coming in. So we definitely think that formalizing this immigration process that's both beneficial to the industry and the fishermen, and being able to track and maintain who's coming into the country for work is definitely something both parties could get behind.
I hope you're right. Thank you.
I hope so too.
Hello, I'm Rourke. I'm a 2L here. I was curious about the fishermen's perspective and whether or not they felt that their working status was violative of their human rights, and whether or not they actually sort of evidenced a desire to take legal action, or they wanted to speak out about their situation.
Oh, sure. Thank you, Rourke. No, nice to meet you. This is my best friend that I told to come. So we did ask every single fisherman, how do you feel that you can't leave the piers? And there are varying answers to this. They want this job in Hawaii. And they also don't want to start trouble because they want to keep this job. We had one fisherman told me, I came to Hawaii because it's paradise. And I said, do you still think it's paradise? And he said, well, it looks like it, I guess, from here, but I can't really experience it. We think they do want agency. I think that it would be daunting to rely on volunteers for your medical needs for 2 years, at least 2 years. I think that agency over their livelihood is something that they want. We can't see a downside for them to have more freedom. And we think that if we could have talked to them for weeks at a time and built that trust, that we would have had more reports of really asking for this legal status.
I also wanted to add on to that like Rachel had mentioned, I think you would also mention, these victims don't really self-identify very often, and because of cultural differences, they might not have the same ideas that American workers would have about exploitative situations or what exactly is expected of foreign workers coming here. So there is that barrier, and again, we just weren't able to kind of breach that barrier or really enforce communication between us and the fishermen in the 1 week that we were there. So I think it's kind of hard. They don't necessarily view it as a human rights issue, and that's something we heard from several advocates.
And to add on one more thing. Yeah. We did hear from some of the individuals who work with the fishermen, as well as some fishermen, that they want to be able to send as much money home to their families as possible. So essentially, if they had legal status and they couldn't, they weren't being confined to their boats, then they would have to, pay rent, and they'd have to, buy their own groceries and all this stuff. But I don't know if that's necessarily in tension with our recommendations, because if the fishermen were paid more, then they could afford those things, and they could probably, it's Honolulu.
They wouldn't have to, right now they have to pay a friend to wire their money home to their families because they can't go to the wiring place.
But, Honolulu's...
A bank, duh. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Honolulu is one of the most expensive housing markets in the country. Living there is not cheap, but having the freedom at least to organize and unionize may lead to, systemic improvements that actually would allow the fishermen to voice their own concerns and needs. Again.
You got a full answer.
Hello, my name is Eli Atuel, and it was a brilliant presentation, great information. My question more so is, Rachel, you showed a picture that was Fort Knox-esque in security. I was wondering how you were able to get access, and after your report, if you think you were able to go back, or did they kind of know how this report was going to be played out? It was just interesting to see all this great information that you guys were able to get.
Thank you. So I think basically we were able to get access to the areas behind those gates because of the Seafarers Ministry. They just played an absolute major role in our whole investigation and research, and we're very grateful for them kind of giving us the backstage pass. However, they're the only ones allowed behind those gates who are not within the industry already. So if someone were to go back, I don't think any of us would be able to access that area again without the Seafarer Ministry help. Let's see, I think second part of the question, am I forgetting?
Do you think you'll be able to, well, I guess you already answered.
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Esther Bushman, and recently retired attorney. I have a thought and a question out of it from the first question that asked whether there were similar situations throughout the country, and it reminded me of reading in the Post about the Maryland crab pickers and the lack of ability of the industry to get foreign workers who had been coming here for years to get proper visas for them through this administration. And I just wonder to what extent that law that the piece of legislation would have any impact on creating quotas and would or would not permit collective activity amongst foreign workers who were in fact permitted to come to this country to work, and how that plays out as one perhaps seeks to educate the legislative process in moving legislation forward.
So I can start with that, and you guys help me. That's a great question. So I'm not exactly sure what the quotas would look like as far as setting quotas for this kind of. I think it's called a D3 visa that the Sustainable Fishing Workforce Protection Act created. But I will say that recently there were D visas created for foreign workers coming to work on cruise ships here in the United States, and we thought that could serve as a type of model for what kind of visas could be allowed for these foreign fishermen coming to work here.
And just in thinking of that, I was thinking Louisiana shrimp fishing and cod in New England, and there are Alaska. There's some really interesting fisheries in the United States.
Yeah, absolutely. And the good thing about this is it would, immigration law is a federal issue. The creation of a visa is a federal issue, so it would be applicable across the United States. How industry specific it would be, I don't know. And obviously that would take a lot of consultation with these different senators' offices and what would be happening with that situation, and obviously what would be able to be passed and what is practical, on the other side of that coin. But definitely a really interesting thing
Just
to
a
think about.
thought as to who's on what committee and where they're from and what perhaps might be commercial pressures in their particular districts.
Well, luckily our instructor is a policy wizard, so she has been a great help in that.
Hi, I'm Megan. I'm a 2L here at Georgetown. And I'm just wondering, you mentioned how they're usually 1 or 2 year contracts. And to what extent in your research or in talking to the fishermen are those lengths of time actually honored through the boats that they're on? And I guess, did you come across a lot of fishermen who had been there for much longer than a 1 or 2 year period?
So we definitely met people who had been there up to 20 years. So there were people who had been there for decades, and they were kind of like the veteran fishermen that I did a group interview on one of the piers, and there was this one man who had been there for 17 years, and everyone was kind of looking to him as like a leader of their group, and he was kind of speaking for many people in the group. So as far as overstaying contracts, I think you'd probably be a bit more familiar with that. But yeah, people definitely stay for decades at a time, and we've met people who didn't go home for 8 to 10 years, 8 to 10 year periods.
Yeah, I think there's some of the kind of coercion that we were touching on earlier can also come into play. So, for example, if a fisherman wants to go home, his job isn't guaranteed if he wants to come back. So this kind of creates an incentive to stay for as long as possible, make as much money as possible, but it also has an extreme toll on the fishermen who feel like they kind of don't have any other choice but to stay because getting back is so difficult, so expensive, and their captain may just not want to have to hire someone who would cost him more. So.
I made this map and it took me a while and I forgot that I made it and I skipped over it. So this is a map of how they get to Hawaii. So that point at the bottom of the map is American Samoa, where they all go to, and then they boat on up to Honolulu. And there, you can't even see the island of Kiribati, but it's that other red line. They actually had to go down to American Samoa and then boat back up.
It's quite the trip.
Which country do they come from?
It's pretty evenly split between Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, and then some from Kiribati.
I think that most of the fishermen we talked to were Filipino, however. Is that fair to say?
I think I mostly spoke.
We think that may be influenced by the fact that the Seafarers Ministry is run by a Filipino American. They speak Tagalog, many of the volunteers. So there are 700 men, like we've mentioned, and 700 men do not come see the Seafarers Ministry every week. So while those that come get a lot of services, that's not every single fisherman over there. Hello, please state your name.
So I'm Melissa, I'm with Humanity United, and I had the great privilege of working with all of these students and with Ashley on this great project, and feel very proud today. So my question is, knowing where we started and where we are now, what have you found to be the most challenging and most surprising and most rewarding parts of this process?
Ooh, good question. I'll start with the challenges. There are many people, we spoke to a lot of stakeholders, and every stakeholder has their influences, their biases, and their agendas, I guess. And so figuring out who's telling you the truth, who to believe, whose story to weigh the most was very challenging. And a great lesson to learn. Also, getting the real story from the fishermen is the most important, and I think something that I will take with me for any other human rights report that I do. learning from the press is very important, but getting on the ground, understanding why these fishermen are here, what they want is the most important than any other stakeholder.
So I think that for me, one of the more surprising things is that a lot of these issues developed, and it almost seemed like kind of by default, like there just wasn't attention paid to necessarily what was going on here after 9/11, when the immigration laws kind of tightened a little bit on how people could come in to Honolulu. That's really when it started being you needed the visa to come in and to like come through the airports and customs, and things really tightened. So I almost felt like some of these people just kind of got like left behind, and that there just wasn't like a visa that was necessarily put in place for them to make sure that they were taken care of. So it's just kind of surprising to see how many people we would talk to about this issue, and they would just kind of be like, oh, I didn't think about that, or I didn't, I just feel like it's kind of like a forgotten group of people that are on the Piers here. And then people hear it and they're astounded and they've never heard anything about it. So that was definitely a surprise for me. I just assumed everybody would be very familiar with some of the issues that were going on. And I think the most rewarding part for me personally was seeing that if some of these recommendations are implemented, there's a very tangible change that could happen. A lot of times we have human rights issues that, they're horrifying and they're terrible, but there's not a lot you can practically do. And here there's a lot that we can practically do as a country and the communities in Hawaii. There's a lot we can do to almost instantly reduce these vulnerabilities. So I think that's a very forward-looking, rewarding part of it, but it was rewarding to work on something where I could imagine a tangible change.
I think the biggest challenge for me was kind of stepping into this research project, having seen like the tip of the iceberg over the summer, but feeling essentially like I had failed in that project. Like I couldn't really uncover anything. Like I could barely wrap my head around, the legal system governing this industry. And so the most rewarding part was kind of having this team of like 10 amazing ladies and, two wonderful, very knowledgeable professors to guide us in really, understanding what was going on the ground and filling in that narrative so that we can put ourselves in a position to help advance the human rights of, a very vulnerable community.
Thank you.
Thanks.